thank you for joining today. I hope that you find this presentation of use to you and the work that you do. George and I certainly find it useful in the work that we do, so I hope our enthusiasm is something that you find interesting as well. This is a focus on New Brunswick, and in case you don't know too much about New Brunswick, it's a province in Canada, Atlantic Canada, 750,000 people, more rural than many provinces, and with a somewhat older population, somewhat lower income on average than the Canadian average, and a resource-based province. So just give you a sense of the kind of location we're speaking from and about. This research in this current phase was funded by the Environmental Trust Fund. It's a very important source of resources here in New Brunswick, and we're always grateful when they support our work. And in this case, they supported the University of New Brunswick in moving forward on advancing some research that we've started over the last couple of years. I'll just start by explaining what frames and narratives are for those of you that aren't used to hearing that kind of just language. When we're talking about a frame, we're talking about an idea that triggers patterns of thinking, and narratives are the way that we talk about that idea. So an example in the context of the conversation we're having today, the frame "Put New Brunswick First" has a narrative that goes something like this. New Brunswick needs to be part of a global transition, building a low-polluting energy system to fuel our economy. This provides an opportunity for us. With cap and trade in place, New Brunswick businesses can gain experience and market advantage in less polluting technologies. Acting now puts us ahead. You can see how that gives you the "Put New Brunswick First" kind of frame. And we developed that kind of frame and narrative with George Marshall from Climate Outreach, who you'll hear from after me. We started this work together in 2015, where George helped develop some draft narratives on carbon pricing, cap and trade, and carbon tax, and we've been working with those ever since to test them and improve them. So the goal of this phase of the research was to better understand, again, which frames and narratives are supported by the broadest spectrum of the population, in particular the center left and the center right. We did that work starting in 2015, as I said, with a survey in Ontario of over 850 Ontarians. And in that particular case, we did not ask about carbon taxes because Ontario had already decided to move to cap and trade. So I also did a national survey testing the original narratives, and we included all three, the general term carbon pricing as well as its variations, carbon tax and cap and trade. We were able to pick up the research because of our new funding and the University of New Brunswick partnership, and looked here at doing focus groups as well as a survey to understand more why people reacted in the way that they did. We didn't really have a sense of that in the original work. And in this case, we were working with 9 frames and narratives that emerged from previous work as being more resonant, if you will, with people. We hired Corporate Research Associates, a firm out here, to do 2 WebEx or electronic focus groups, one in English and one in French. That's a random sample generated participant list. We screened out, importantly, people who were neither extremely concerned or not at all concerned about climate change, because we wanted to, as I said, get people who were in the center and somewhat concerned, or very concerned. We did 1 focus group at the University of New Brunswick from volunteers who responded to a solicitation. So in total, we had 20 people in focus groups, and at that time, I tested 8 narratives. When I went to the survey, I added 1 more just to see how it went. We asked also in the survey what their concern level was about climate change, so we could compare how those various ranges in concern responded to narrative. As I said, there were 9, and we tested support for carbon pricing, cap and trade, and carbon tax before they were exposed to the narratives and after they were exposed to the narratives. We asked them about their overall perception of how effective carbon pricing might be. And for each narrative, we asked if they would indicate, did you believe what the statement was saying? Do you think it would be effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And do you think it was a good way to describe carbon pricing, carbon tax, or cap and trade? So results. Generally speaking, in terms of the perceived effectiveness of carbon pricing as a tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, people were right in the middle, somewhat support. There's not one way or the other. So in many ways, a good thing, an openness to carbon pricing. We also asked a series of questions about why people felt the way they did about carbon pricing, cap and trade, or carbon tax. And these are the issues that really came to the top. The most important one is that primarily people believe that carbon pricing will raise their cost of living. It's a personal concern. And this was particularly the case for older New Brunswickers and least the case with younger people. But at the same time, 77% believe it's smart policy to make polluters pay for their contribution to climate change. This was particularly true for younger people, women, and francophones. And 70% also believed that putting a price on carbon would benefit the environment. Again, women more strongly in favor, as were francophones. And importantly, 69% said it was important to take responsibility now for climate change so our grandchildren won't have to. And again, women and francophones more inclined toward these views. The complaint we often hear about pricing carbon is that it's a tax grab of government. And yes, a majority did believe that that was the case, primarily men, not women. And they also, though, felt, still a majority, that it was a fair plan for society to take these steps, and francophones in particular had this view. And just over half believe that it will hurt the economy. And frankly, given the other numbers that I just shared with you, this is a pretty low score relative to feeling it could help the environment and have other benefits. And less than a majority thought it was just going to be too complicated. So it's not an administrative issue. We asked people what their concern was with respect to climate change. Overall, it's 91%, but we really wanted to refine that in order to understand how respondents related to the narratives and their climate change concerns. So 25% are very concerned, 32% concerned, and 34% somewhat concerned. So we're really interested in that band of somewhat concerned and concerned. And responses to the narrative show a pattern. There most definitely is a pattern. If you're somewhat concerned about climate change, you tend to be in the somewhat agree category for the narratives. If you're more concerned about climate change, you tend to straddle between I somewhat agree and strongly agree. And if you're very concerned about climate change, you tend to strongly agree. It's exactly the pattern we expect to see. And that's important because these patterns mirror political orientation, and there's been lots of research to show that this is the case. The more liberal you are, the more concerned you are about climate change. The more conservative, you're less concerned. And what we're after here is to understand the people right there in the middle who are somewhat concerned, on the center left and center right. 4 of the 9 narratives came out on top, if you will, with the strongest total scores for believability, effectiveness, and a good way to describe whatever it was we were talking about in that particular narrative. This one here, the top ranking, is a narrative that has the frame, it makes sense that if you pollute more, you pay more. The second highest was a polluter pay ethical frame, that polluters should pay. That was a fair and accountable and responsible thing to do. A second, a market-oriented or economy-oriented frame, market failure, so we need a market signal to respond to that. And a fourth narrative that also is ethical, so 2 economy-oriented frames and 2 ethically oriented frames, personal responsibility, and companies should follow, and I'll obviously describe those. What was interesting was that the narratives that were least supported were narratives that kind of had relationships to government. Clearly a very low level of trust in the role of government and what government will do with the money. And you can see here that a narrative that we had that talked about the role of government scored very low. So just a little bit of information about the top 4 narratives. So here's what that narrative says. Pricing pollution makes sense. Businesses that pollute more pay more. I'm just moving my screen here. Hold on a sec. It's right in my way. If you use energy efficiently, you pay less. It encourages companies to invest in solutions and to develop new technologies. And you can see this one scored very high for believability, followed by effectiveness and description. But what's interesting here is this narrative was most supported by people over the age of 35, and it had the pattern that we were talking about. That is, that if you're somewhat concerned about climate change, you somewhat agreed with this narrative. And if you were concerned, you straddled both the somewhat agree and strongly agree. And if you were very concerned about climate change, you strongly agreed with this narrative. What was interesting was that in the focus groups, they said they liked this narrative because they perceived the individual as small polluters and, yes, had some responsibility, but that industry should be the focus as the major source of pollution. The second ranked narrative was that it's not fair. It was a polluter pay. So it reads, it's not fair that heavy energy users can dump their carbon pollution into the air we all breathe. Polluters should be held accountable and should pay for the pollution they force us all to live with. A carbon tax is a fair way to share responsibility for carbon pollution that causes climate change and to reward those that are most efficient and pollute the least. Had good scores for believability, followed by effectiveness and descriptiveness. And what's interesting with this ethical frame is it was most strongly supported by younger people and women. There's a difference constantly that emerges between men and women and this age-related dimension. The focus groups, however, really liked this narrative, and they liked it because it was direct, it was personal. There was a real skepticism anytime a narrative was vague. We got language like that's just government talk. They wanted specificity. They wanted clarity in what we were asking for or talking about. And that really influenced this frame in particular, the third ranking frame, market failure, market signal. It says we need to put a price on carbon because this sends a signal to consumers and businesses that they should shift to alternatives like more efficient manufacturing equipment, vehicles, appliances, or renewable energy like wind and solar. The previous version of that really just ended at alternatives, and it was not well liked. They wanted to know what we were talking about. And when you leave it vague, it really decreased trust in what we were talking about. So very important to be specific. And again, you can see here that how the scores ranked. What's interesting is that women really liked this. This is a very big difference between men and women, as well as francophones. And the focus groups talked about this narrative. Why they liked it was that necessity was the mother of invention. And that correcting the market failure would unleash creativity. The fourth ranked and a very ethical frame says we should all take personal responsibility for reducing pollution. We try to do the right thing by recycling or buying environmentally friendly products. A carbon tax is one way to make sure we all show the same level of responsibility for reducing the pollution we put into our air. Now, this one had a lower score overall, and you can see here that it does better on effectiveness and descriptiveness, not necessarily believability. And women were more supportive, as were francophones. You can see a very strong difference between francophones and anglophones here. And this is important because the personal message really seemed to resonate culturally. Focus group participants agreed everyone did have to do their part, but again, were resistant to the message that they should be doing something if big polluters were not. As I mentioned, the least supported narratives were the ones relating to government and what they were going to do, although francophones clearly seemed to have a stronger trust in the government's capacity to regulate and a very high score relative to anglophones. What's interesting is the put New Brunswick first, a kind of frame that is often used, that we want to compete in the world economy and do all these great things, did not really do that well. It's not that it's, I mean, 64% in a combined score, but it wasn't as strong a message as I thought it might have been. As was the where does the money go message. I thought that there would have been stronger response to that, but as George will explain, that he probably could have told me not to bother with it beforehand. But Francophones were quite supportive of this, and I wouldn't give up on it so much. It's just that it's likely resonating with a much smaller group, certainly not that middle-of-the-road person we're looking to attract. Narratives that didn't really do well at all were simple and honest and balanced, although this idea of balance, again, was negatively responded to in focus groups. It sounded like government talk and marketing talk to people, but Francophones responded well to it. So the whole point, did anything happen? Once you've been exposed to these narratives, did anything happen? Did people change their perspective? And indeed they did. There was a real shift in support, somewhat support. You'll see the first bar is before they were exposed to narratives, the second bar after. So the gray and the yellow is carbon pricing, the middle two is carbon tax, and the last two are cap and trade. The greatest gain was in support for cap and trade, which is exactly what happened in Ontario. And of course, we also had some improvement in the strongly support, and again, more for cap and trade. But it's important to look at the strongly opposed. There was very little change there. In fact, there was a decline in support post exposure to narratives, and this is a process of motivated reasoning that we see often in the research that we do. That people are garnering. If you have a point of view, you're garnering what you're seeing as information and putting it against to shore up your point of view. The people here in the middle didn't really have a point of view, and so they were open to what they were exposed to and then shifted their views. So I just show those numbers, and you can see that, in fact, cap and trade shows increased support more than the others, and that's partly, I think, because so few people understood what it was. There were a lot of answers that said, I've not heard of this before, I don't know what it is. Women shifted more than men, and that makes sense because they also scored highest before exposure, saying they were not sure in their answers or they had not heard of this. And men were more inclined to hold their position. Younger people also shifted more than older people, and I just provide some of those results for you there. There were some other demographic influences, not education and income, but location. So more rural, remote communities or participants from rural, remote communities were more inclined to believe pricing carbon would hurt the economy, and urban dwellers were more inclined to strongly agree that it's good to take responsibility now and less inclined to believe it will hurt the economy. And that urban-rural split shouldn't surprise many people on the call, I'm sure. So just to take you to the summary now a little bit. So I would say that New Brunswickers are moderately inclined to believe carbon pricing could be effective, but are definitely concerned about the effects on their pocketbook and to a lesser degree the economy. I think the response in terms of design has to be around the personal perspective, less so the economy. Yet, we have strong majorities that think it's smart policy, that it could protect the environment, and it's the right thing to do to protect future generations from climate change. Definitely a story here that women and younger New Brunswickers are supportive. Women are less aware, and so we would probably want to pay attention to how we make sure women have more information available to them. And clearly strong support from Francophones in terms of a stronger role for personal and corporate responsibility as well as a role for government. And I would say that my take on this is that New Brunswickers are open to learning more and willing to support pricing carbon, but they lack government, lack trust in government, and so design will need to really attend to those key issues. So just to summarize, we've got 4 top-ranking narratives. 2 are what I would call logical. You pollute more, you pay more, and you innovate while doing it. Or logical in the sense of efficient signal to shift to alternatives. The other 2, ethical. Polluter pay because it's fair, it's accountable, it's responsible, or it's ethical because we all have to do our part. Other foreign narratives, not so much. There was some openness to where does the money go, but others didn't really click. It would be important to note, though, that this balance idea, which Anglophones did not respond well to, was not that offensive to Francophones. So I would encourage that for those of us that are in the world of having to communicate about carbon pricing, as we all are right now, that we emphasize the common sense nature, that if you pollute more, you need to do more to clean it up. That smart policy is sending clear signals that reward businesses that find solutions and pollute the least. Carbon pricing is a good way to stimulate innovation and creativity, and a fair way to share responsibility and be accountable for pollution going into the air we all breathe. This idea of air and that we all breathe is a fundamental piece of creating that sense of collectivity. And we should be emphasizing that it is a way to take responsibility today to lessen the environmental burden for our grandchildren. I'd also note that we should be specific about the solutions and the actions that are needed or stimulated by the policy, but rather than talking about the details of carbon pricing policy. And that is, I think, the fundamental mistake that most people make. That's not what people need to hear. They need to know what it's going to do. And we need to address this concern for personal and economic costs. So we'll take questions after I hand this over to George. So Alex, I will minimize this, and should I take myself off of share? So.
Thanks. That was great. George, I'm going to make you the presenter now, so if you're ready.
I'm ready. Right. Can people see me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello. It's always exciting and magical being able to do this across a huge body of water. Welcome from rather dark and rainy Wales. And let me just bring up now, share. Let me check again. I'm going to need Alex to confirm that I'm sharing okay.
You're good.
Am I good? Hello, everybody. Okay. I've entitled this "Speaking to the Middle Ground." I'm not going to repeat what Louise was saying. I'm going to try and add some interpretation to it, which might be interesting. You can see me and Alex both there in our team. We're based largely in Oxford, although Alex and myself are in Wales. We're specialising very much in this values-based communication specialism on climate communications. I think it's fair to say we're the leading specialists in Europe on climate change communications, which is how we came to work with Louise. We have a particularly strong interest in how to communicate around people's identity and values. And the reason for that, and there's a very strong evidence base for this, is that people's attitudes are in the form of narratives, as we've heard, and frames from Louise, that signal to people their in-group identity and validate their values. In other words, we need to reflect to people who they are, their sense of their group identity, and what their values are. That needs to be embodied in what we say. And that is actually far more important for people's acceptance of your position than the specific detail even. People scan the information which comes towards them and then make a decision on the basis of basically whether it's talking to people like them or not. We had a very good recent case of this with the what's called Brexit, the campaign to remove Britain from the European Union, where despite huge amounts of economic evidence and expert advice concerning the impacts of leaving the European Union, the campaign was entirely argued around identity, national identity, collective identity, and to a large part these central values, not the Islamist extremism one so much, that's appealing to the far right, but certainly the one concerning we send the European Union £350 million a week, let's fund our National Health Service instead, so like an appeal to health-based values and self-protection, which we'll hear is relevant for these climate narratives too. When you look at the division of attitudes to climate change, Here you can see from research done in Canada, if you look at these figures there on the left-hand side for very concerned, and the figures on the right not at all concerned, you can see a very marked political polarization. That means, therefore, that people's sense of their political identity is absolutely central to this. 3/4 of the people, incidentally, in this not at all concerned category are men. So there is a gender division there when it comes to marked skepticism. And as we've been hearing from Louise, the critical group for obtaining a public majority is this right-wing and central ground. So the centre generally, but in particular the centre-right. That's for getting the majority. So it's like we can get significant numbers of people without appealing to this group. If we're going to sway public policy and have political influence, we have to reach that centre. Quite a lot of us in communications are talking now about a strategy. I'm calling it here the sandwich strategy, but other specialists have similar approaches, maybe with different names. The sandwich strategy means that the key model for change, the change model is about building support in that middle ground. It's, as it were, the filling of the sandwich. But that is the critical group. Our communications must speak effectively to that group, but also in a way where we don't lose the support of the base, but we don't unnecessarily aggravate opponents. And if that sounds like a hard demand, it is entirely possible. And when we've been doing this research together, we've been looking for language which does exactly that, which appeals to that central ground, but looking very carefully at whether we lose the support of our base of very, very committed, concerned, generally left-leaning climate change people, but also whether it aggravates or antagonizes the people who maybe are never going to be great supporters. But it is very important nonetheless that they are not mobilized as an oppositional force too powerfully. In my presentation, I'm going to be drawing on a large body of work that we have done over the years on communicating with the centre-right. We're talking about the centre-left here as well, but there's a lot of common ground actually between centre-left and centre-right in many of these values. You're very welcome to look at our website, Climate Outreach, and have a look at some of our research on this. And I'm going to draw out some of these key findings and then apply those to what we're learning about the narratives in New Brunswick. It's fair to say there's a range of conservative values. I'm drawing here on a very wide body of evidence. Novelty and change means tried and tested approaches. This relates strongly to language around common sense, sensible, reliable, tested. Very skeptical of centralizations. That means things which are couched in terms of grand theories are wary. But as we found when we looked at these narratives here, people are very wary of the vested interests of both commercial and state power blocks. So we'll be finding this coming through again and again. Generally speaking, respect for authority. People like closure and certainty. We know this very strongly about this, but people like things. This is where we're finding messages about authenticity, things which are trusted. We were hearing already from Louise messages about what felt personal, what felt real, and people like to know. They like evidence that things work. They like confidence that something is known to work, going back on those tried and tested approaches. People do not like pollution and are very concerned about health, these purity arguments. That's why the successful narratives consistently built on both pollution and health. Fairness is a key determinant around these values. For people on the left, on the marked left, fairness is expressed in terms of social equality, social justice. For people in the centre, it's more a matter that there's a fair relationship between getting the rewards for doing the right thing and getting punished for doing the wrong thing. This fairness is absolutely key to finding the right narratives. This group is sensitive to negativity and ugly arguments, ugliness, aesthetic ugliness as well. And it aspires to happiness. So arguments about how something will build a better life are consistently in all communications, not even just climate change, more effective with this group than telling people if they don't do it, it's going to be terrible. So you have a choice. You can say, if we don't take action on climate change, we'll all go to fry. Or you can have an argument of saying, if we do take action, we can have a better life. It is that second argument which consistently works best. So when we were originally designing the narratives for this first range of work that we did in Ontario, we were looking there at building on these things, these qualities that we were drawing out there. And these are some of the key words we find. Incidentally, you might notice responsibility there. This, for example, from a speech from Stephen Hopper when he came over and spoke to the British Parliament, strung together from a series of words based on RE, building things back, putting things back, these returning, rebuilding, remaking RE phrases, things language from his speech, reaffirming, rewarding, returning, responsible, rediscover. So we tried to build that into the narratives as well. We removed from the narratives from the outset language which we knew did not work with this central, especially centre-right audience. Profiteering by big business, I'll come back to that point. We know social justice arguments work extremely badly with this central audience, although of course they work well with the left. Outgroup green identity markers is important. People are generally speaking distrustful if something comes with a strong label saying this is coming from people who are not our group. Remember, this is a lot of loyalty in this group. So language around green, although a little bit of it slipped in, but avoiding things saying this is green, this is environmental, this is eco, this is about saving the planet, is clearly important for this group. It has to be seen to be coming from trusted intermediaries. I just wanted to say that campaigners, and I've worked for all of my life in the environmental movement, consistently make the same mistakes when they think that they're speaking to this central and centre-right audience. They talk about competitive advantage, how things are good for big business. It's clear, and we've found in our evidence on this, that people do not like this kind of message, nor do they like language about leadership and dominance, even though campaigners think they do. National security arguments, generally speaking, don't go down as well as they should, and unfortunately they also trigger a whole set of other very defensive values which don't work well for climate change. But in particular, people do not like conservative arguments that are conveyed by non-conservative communicators. Now, this is missing from research, but I have to add to it. It's very, very important. If the messages that are effective must be communicated by people and sources and media which are regarded as trusted for this centre or centre-right audience. If they are coming from people they do not trust, they will see it as manipulative. And we found in some of the feedback from this that sometimes the messages were regarded as being distrusted because of the voice and the tone. This is critically important. So we have to match up the right communicator with the right message. As Louise has already explained, this is a significant body of work now. I should add, but before we even went into designing the trial narratives, I drew on research which has been done in Washington State, in the US, and Australia. I think this is really a very significant international piece of research now, so I think hopefully we should get out there and really start to share it around the world. I think it's of international importance. Right. Quickly, dig into the narratives. Before we even moved on to the narratives tested in New Brunswick, some narratives were removed that have been shown to fail in Ontario. This narrative, I'm not going to read it out to you, you can see it for yourself, which had a high component of talking about costs, failed strongly. That means that when in a narrative you foreground this negative concept of costs, you bring that to mind, and that people then reject it by pushing it away. They start thinking of it as a cost. So even if you're talking about the costs of climate change, people start thinking about the costs of the measures you take for it. Another narrative that we found failed when we tried it in Ontario is arguments about cost and insecurity, pointing out that climate change makes things insecure and carbon pricing reflects that insecurity. Well, people don't want to be reminded about insecurity or danger or negative costs. Again, it brings that particular elephant into the room, and people therefore respond by pushing it away. As I said, this particular group rejects negativity. Of course, it works a little bit better with people already engaged with that kind of way of thinking. Talking about market advantage, Louise has mentioned that didn't do so well in Ontario, and it is an issue. It's interesting. It's interesting because something was one would tend to think that this might work well with this audience, especially people on the more conservative end. it raises what we could say are extrinsic values, competitive extrinsic values, which wider testing around the areas of values research shows that it mitigates against people's desire to work collectively for common purpose, and this is well established experimentally. So we need to be looking for intrinsic values about collective identity and collective welfare, and this was reflected in the findings. So I think what's interesting is by the time we moved on to New Brunswick, two of those narratives had already been removed. So it's not surprising that we found that the priming worked well in New Brunswick in terms of shifting people's attitudes, as Louise already said, because they were being presented with a selection of narratives which were all in various ways effective. There was nothing in the pack which would not work well because we had already removed it. So really, I think we can say actually that everything that was tested was to some degree effective. Now what we're doing is we're looking at trying to pin down what are the effective components of the most effective components. Let's try and pin some of them down. This number one, which worked best in New Brunswick, we've already heard from Louise, actually already worked well in Ontario. I think the picture of my image is slightly cutting that out, but that underneath it says that in Ontario. It's that language about common sense. Our wider research shows that people really like that. This is common sense, this is trusted, this is reliable, this is straightforward, tried and tested. So it's not some external ideological experiment. It's something which is just basic common sense. And the balance that this narrative contains between rewards for the good, for people doing the right thing, and costs for the people who don't, fits very well with what in the wider literature we would call a just world theory, that things are balanced out and fair between the two sides. Flexibility responded well, we know, in the focus groups. And actually in the focus groups, people really like this language about unleashing the creativity. This spoke very well across all of the groups and all of the surveys, so we know that this is really effective language. Again, very positive, very upbeat, about how can we use a government policy in order to open up the creativity of enterprise. It's very effective language. The second most effective one is fairness. As I said already, fairness is a significant value out there in Ontario. This is actually the most effective in the Ontario work because it was really the perfect sandwich strategy language. It worked very well with the people at the centre, very well with some of the people on the centre right, and it was good enough to maintain and reinforce the base. So fair being the key frame in this case, it puts the blame, as it were, a blame externally. It uses language of dumping, which is associated in people's minds with waste, which is also, as we know, an effective language. This language of forcing their pollution on us has a strong resonance. And again, this justice idea. Just world, this is fair, the good guys get rewarded, and the others who don't do the right thing, they maybe don't get punished, but at least they face costs. The issue with this one, and actually for quite a lot of the narratives, is whether we get the right balance in the fairness between the different partners, between ourselves as consumers or as individuals, the general public, with business, with government. And there's a balancing job here. It's a nuance. And actually, as Louise already said, it expressed itself differently with different focus groups. So there's a lot of variation here. It's hard to find it. In the focus groups, it was clear that even though people liked this one, they liked the language of accountability, incidentally. Always a strong sign you've got the right frame in focus groups is when people in the discussion keep repeating the word or the frame. So these three quotes, incidentally, from UNB means University of New Brunswick, from the focus group there. When people kept saying accountable, we know that this is an effective frame and works very well. We also know that health works well. There's a danger with this, of course, which is that when we talk about pollution, people may be thinking too much about visible, breathable air pollution rather than the carbon pollution, which is critical for climate change, which actually does not have a direct health effect. And carbon dioxide is not, in that sense, have a health effect. So maybe we have to be a little bit careful with how far we play on the health. But the air we breathe, incidentally, was language which has been very well developed and tested over in the United States. and clearly it resonated with the groups. But there were dangers here, as I said. Again, all of these are quotes directly from the focus groups. FR means the French focus groups. People reported they found it negative, aggressive. It seemed to put maybe too much weight, some of the people said, on putting pressure on industry, maybe too moralistic. So here maybe the balance is, we say it's not fair, but maybe the response and the narrative doesn't appear to be sufficiently fair. Here's another one, the responsibility one, of course, takes it the other way. Responsibility then looks at whether the fair response is one which is focusing on us as individuals. And again, as Louise says, this does well, interestingly, particularly well with the French groups. So responsibility, a good central frame, works well. The metaphors were a bit of a problem with this, and the focus groups, what's interesting was that when people read it and discussed in the focus groups, they tended to go off on tangents, talking about whether they burnt firewood in their house or whether they had their car emissions checked, whether they had fuel-efficient cars. There's always a bit of a danger with metaphors, that they can be a distraction, but the metaphor takes over the whole message. I think we have to be very careful with that. We know also in Ontario, this did well. It did well with the somewhat concerned. Not so well with the base, but again, it's that somewhat concerned we're after. But again, we had here, it went the other way. Here, people felt that it carried the weight too much onto the individual. And therefore, again, we have a balancing issue here. So really, we have to find a narrative which talks about a balance of responsibility. When we push it one way or the other way, we get pushback from people saying no. The attempt of all in this together narrative was to try and do this, was to try and say, we all want to do things together, and that climate pricing is a way to resolve this, so that actually everybody pitches in and everybody can pull their weight. This language was strongly supported in Ontario, and it's talking about shared values and pulling together. Again, language around fairness. This idea that there's a shared contract, that we all pull together and we do what we can. This did not do so well in focus groups, but I have to say my interpretation about it is that it rested with the actual crafting of the language and the narrative more than the content. My personal interpretation is that this content is in the right ballpark, talking about shared collective contracts. The response appeared to be more with tone, that the language, don't we all like, is maybe, it was actually taken from some research work done in America. Maybe it was a little bit too American and upbeat. There was something in the language which didn't work. People didn't like the open-endedness. It's like, well, people want the closure. What does this mean? And again, it seemed to bring up some issues of fairness. So something in that didn't work, but my personal view is it's in the right place. The language where we said, this is what government does best and this is what businesses does best, which also performed fairly well, but again, playing around and experimenting with this language of balance, the idea that there's a set of balanced roles. Government does one thing, business does another thing. Unfortunately, as Louise says, it runs into cynicism, not just about government, actually, but also about business. And when you start saying, this is what government does best and this is what business does best, it seems to bring to mind in people what they think government does worst and what business does worst. In other words, when we looked at the responses, it's aspiring to having balanced roles, but actually when we look at what people say, having said that, then it immediately triggers in them talking about how they don't trust either of them, and that government on the one hand is trying to put this in as another tax. But the thing that businesses are trying to do is the thing that they do best is trying to rip people off and make profits. So there's something in that language. I thought this is very interesting and revealing. It goes to show the huge importance of this kind of qualitative testing brings to the fore things which otherwise would be very hard to detect. So what's great about this research is we now have a balance of qualitative and quantitative testing reinforcing each other. Now we're starting to see maybe what works and what doesn't work. Drawing on this, to draw some more general conclusions, I think it was this. hiding a tax is something to be very wary of in the language around this. Whether it's actually a carbon tax or whether it's cap and trade. This language here of saying it's hiding a tax. There are different strategies for dealing with this, and I think this probably would require, if anybody turns it into policy language, more specific testing. I think it's very important for people to closure and certainty so that they can see what leads to what, where the money goes, what's it for, and how it works. But I think there might be an argument for calling a tax a tax. It's a common misunderstanding of people, particularly on the left, that people in the centre and the centre-right are fundamentally opposed to taxes. That is a mistake. Actually, in fact, people on the right are far more inclined to pay their taxes as a form of social responsibility than people on the left. What is important there, though, is what the tax is for and what is done with it. So I think we found in this taxing language that people had mixed views on taxing within the French group, which in some ways was actually quite conservative in its attitudes. People were accepting the idea of things costing more money if it produced improved air quality and better health, as you can see there. People were also wary of the idea that if you just said, okay, it's a cost for business, but somehow the consumer was off the hook, because quite rightly they recognize that businesses goes up, everybody pays. That's one thing to say. So be upfront and be honest. This integrity and authenticity is very important. Showing how it works is important too. Again, from these quotes from the focus groups, the big question for me is, does it work? You say it ensures, well, what's the proof it ensures anything? So therefore showing causality, rather than just having, of course, we're just testing little narratives, but actually if this is ever applied, it is very important in a clear and focused way to show what causes what. Louise says there was some testing of where things would go. It didn't do great when we tried it out in Ontario, this idea about where the money would go. It's an interesting question as to why not. I think probably when that happens, it raises in people's minds the questions of whether they approve of what those programs are. And it produces other divisions about whether people like the programs or don't like the programs. The argument there was a carbon tax to pay for programs that produce a greener, healthier quality of life. I'm not quite sure why this was a problem. I suspect it was, again, because of distrust of government. This was tried out again in the University of New Brunswick, where people seemed to like it. But actually, in reality out there, it didn't work that well in the testing. Finally, the market failure language here, it worked okay in Ontario, especially for more concerned people. It's pro-market language, so it works well with people who have a strong trust and belief in the market. And that's why, and suggests the power of the market. We got some interesting pushback from the focus group in the University of New Brunswick on this, but it's a kind of technical economy speak. Again, this issue of the authenticity and reliability of the spokesperson. And interestingly, again, we keep coming up against this issue of where the onus of responsibility lies between business and the consumer. And this, I think, is absolutely key to getting it right, of making it clear where and how the responsibility is shared. Again, you can see in the quotes here, people responding very strongly in terms of where the responsibility lies. In this case, they regarded the market as being a way that responsibility was shifted back to the consumer. Balanced language, as we said, did not work so well in Ontario. It was tested again, and we tried out some of it in the University of New Brunswick, putting in some of these re-words that we know works well. Renewing, revitalizing. Talking about balance as a frame, we know that balance works well. It's interesting that people's response of saying that it sounded like the voice of government. This is something to be very wary of, that a lot of its language and phrasing has already been corrupted, I think we can say polluted, by its associations with government PR. People are intrinsically suspicious of it. I have to say, we know from our wider research that talking about win-wins does not go down well. People are wary of that kind of language about, hey, you can do this, and it actually wins on every front. I think that's the point where people's cynicism kicks in. So I guess finally what I would just say is, maybe if we put it together, an optimal narrative is one which puts various aspects of these things together, the components from the various narratives at work. Because there will never be any one single narrative, there will be a component of different ones. I think we have enough evidence now to say fairness works, common sense works, but if we show causality and clarity as to how it works, what happens to the money, and how, especially the balance is made between business, government, and consumer, I think we have a winning narrative. Louise asked me just to show a couple of things for a couple of minutes about our other work which relates to this. In Scotland, as an organisation, we've been working here specifically with the government on how we can apply conversations between peers. As I said before, the most important thing actually is the communicators, the perception of the authenticity of the communicator. And finally, a piece of work that we've been doing in India, and we would be very interested in working with partners in Canada over, with narratives actually doing what we have done together on this, but helping groups on the ground in India to develop and design narratives. And currently, as I speak now, we have focus groups running across India. That's 2 that we had just last week, being run by organizations there. So this is the idea that actually there are ways of making this kind of high-quality research affordable and applied by groups on the ground. And after the Indian pilot, we already have strong interest from groups all around the world to roll this out. Okay, I will end on this point there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George.
And I will stop sharing them again. Right.
Great. So thanks to both of our presenters for their presentations. What we're going to do now is I'm going to people have been asking questions via the Q&A chat feature, and I'm going to now basically pitch those questions to you both. So what I'll do is I'll ask the question, and then I'll make one of you the presenter, and then just answer the question in as much detail as you see fit. So the first one, Louise, really is for you, and a few people have asked, why is there this difference between the English and the French-speaking focus groups? Why is it that English speakers and French speakers are stating quite different sentiments about carbon pricing? It's clear that that's the case, but I think people are pondering, why. So I'm just going to make you the presenter again, and away you go.
Okay, great. Well, if you do any work on a national basis in Canada, these results won't surprise you at all. If you do a national poll in Canada, the results for Quebec are very different than the rest of Canada. And in New Brunswick, we have an Anglophone and a Francophone population. There are cultural differences, the French primarily in the north, and in fact, quite connected to Quebec. So there are different cultural perspectives, different perspectives on the role of government, clearly. I'd also say a more collective perspective. My own family is from northern New Brunswick, and I would say there's very much a collective experience there. Cooperatives are more active there, and so on. So it's a different cultural worldview, and the results demonstrate that, and the results in New Brunswick are consistent with the kind of differences you see between Quebec, for example.
That's great, thanks. We see similar results in Wales, and I often wonder whether, in some ways, bilingualism promotes a kind of internationalism. Like you live your life in 2 languages, you have a more global perspective sometimes. The second question, and this is sort of trying to summarize a few things that people have asked in various different ways, but I think can be expressed as the research has been done. So what happens next? How is this kind of rolled out? How is this sort of passed over to the people who need to use it? in their day-to-day work in actually doing this communication and doing this convincing with the wider public. And I think that Louise, if you can have a shot at that, and then George, I think there are some questions that will come to you for afterwards.
Absolutely. So this research, just as when we did it in Ontario and when I did a national survey, we'll be sharing broadly. So I do that through all of my university networks as well as through non-government or business networks and so on. So this is available to anyone. We're also hoping to have George come to Canada, to New Brunswick and potentially Ottawa in June to do some train-the-trainer sessions. And I can tell you that each time we do this and the more that I learn, I'm constantly working to apply it in all the communications that I do. Anyone who works with me knows that I do that with them ad nauseum. I'm always saying, but. And so, we share and make this broadly available. I'm happy to share the data. There's no hesitancy there to make this something that everybody can take advantage of.
That's great. Thanks. I'm going to, the next few questions I'm going to pitch to George, if that's all right. Louise, if you want to intervene, please do just kind of turn your microphone on and do so. George, I'm just going to make you the presenter so that you can answer these a bit more easily. I'm sort of summarizing a few different things that have come in the Q&A. George, you've worked on projects that are similar in a number of different national contexts. So here in Canada and with a specific region in Canada, but also with India and in Scotland and in Wales. How important are these national differences in the narratives that need to be used? I think what people are really getting at here is like, how different are they, or are the things that are common across a number of these different nations and regions that we can draw on?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think the starting point of it, and as actually is already Louise was pointing out with the difference between Francophone and Anglophone Canadians, is probably not to assume anything even within national jurisdictions, but there are, going back to my original point, that attitudes to climate change are extremely culturally determined. So, I think there's always a role for testing everything. One of the things which is interesting is the commonality between people. If you say, what makes you special? Then we know if we do this, say, in research in Australia, here in Wales, in Canada, I'm sure, people very often say the same thing as a sign of their own specialness. So people say, well, here in Wales, we really, really care about our families. We really care about our communities. Well, so you'll find the people across the world. So in other words, what people mark as being a mark of their particular identity is actually often remarkably universal, but they don't see it as such. They see it as a mark of their own identity. That being said, there are significant differences between different cultures. One of the ones which I think I already brought out was this one in terms of attitude towards leadership and competitiveness. Some cultures have a much more inward-looking, sometimes secure, sometimes more defensive position, where they don't aspire to leadership. In fact, leadership demands really play down. I think we saw that a little bit with some of this language about, New Brunswick having a competitive advantage and so on. That's probably not language, from my understanding, works very well in Canada. Certainly, I know in here in Wales it would work well. With more outward-going, more competitive societies like America, you see that language about how this is an opportunity for America to really lead in the world is very powerful. I have to say, similarly, for very confident societies like China, you find this language works better. So there are issues around that. And then I'd say another final thing maybe is the question of what exactly people identify with. In some countries, people have a very strong sense of national identity, which means that actually we could be looking at doing climate communications around national threats and national opportunity. Other countries have a strongly non-nationalistic identity, either because they have a lot of internal divisions within society, or their sense of nationhood isn't that strong. So, and I think that also reflects on how much one can focus on individual audiences when we speak. So if we are communicating very widely across a population, obviously we're looking for values that can be held consistently across that population, which may be in terms of their national identity. If, however, we are focusing in and we can target a particular audience, then we would not be looking for that national identity. We'd be looking specifically for what makes those people have their own sense of identity. In all of these things, the key determinant is going to be what are the individual words or frames which speak to people's identity, such that when they hear it, that little kind of their antenna are wiggling, they hear a little light go on saying, that's me, that's who I am, that's my kind of language, that's my kind of person. As Louise said, going right back to the beginning, it's those key frames which trigger people's sense of value.
Thanks, George. There's a question now that I think it would make sense perhaps for both of you to address. So if we can go with George first while I've got you as the presenter, and then Louise, sure. I'll switch the video feed over to you. It's a question about the uptake of these ideas by government, and I think we should probably read that as meaning national government or regional or local government. Yeah. But it's really about how open political leaders are to the ideas that you're researching and presenting. Do you find, and I'm sort of paraphrasing the question here, do you find that politicians and government officials are very open to looking at this research and then changing the way they communicate with the public? Or do you find them stuck in their ways and very much saying, no, we've got a way of doing this and we're going to carry on with it? So George, perhaps if you could draw on your experience from Wales and Scotland, and then Louise, I'll switch over to you and perhaps you can reflect on Canada and New Brunswick.
Well, I'd say the primary problem we face at the moment is that governments have actually largely abandoned their role of engaging with the public in any way on climate change. And the Framework Convention on Climate Change, all of the signatories, which includes every country in the world now, is required under Article 6 to actively educate and inform their public about climate change. But there are now very, very few programs to do that. So the grounds of actually getting a government interested in the research is limited by virtue of the fact that the governments are often not even doing it. That's one thing to say. I think another problem is that people in senior policy positions do not understand how tricky it is to navigate this. They often have a very limited idea of what is necessary for doing climate communications. They don't understand the political polarization or the cultural complexity of it. And the thing which we found repeatedly in our experience is that even though we and our colleagues and many academics will be presenting the government with strong evidence-based research, they will then go and hand the contract over to some advertising company that will come up with some, whiz-bang catchy slogan without actually really thinking about whether the thing works or not. So the answer to that is yes, there are political policy people, individuals who are very interested in this, and hopefully increasingly so. And that usually comes down to an individual basis. You have an individual person you're working with. We now have the ear of the climate change minister in Britain who is alert to this and is trying to find, especially he's conservative, he's trying to find conservative narratives on this, but it tends to be individual. We've still got a long way to go to persuade people of the importance of communication at all, I think.
Thanks, George. Louise, I'm just going to switch over to you, and perhaps if you could address the same question, which is about the uptake of these ideas by politicians and government officials.
I wouldn't actually target a government as a segment of the population, if you will, that could or couldn't take this up. I agree with George that there's not enough being done to educate the public. We still have very high levels of misunderstanding, particularly about the human-caused aspects of climate change. So education is fundamental. Raising money to do climate change research from a communications perspective is the hardest thing I do. And I've always tried to raise funds to do climate change communications research, and it's very difficult to do. Funders don't understand the need for it. But we are getting it done. And for example, with this research, I will, as I always do, make available these results for briefings that we will do to government officials and to ministers at their will. If they would like it, we will do that for them. And we do find that we see it resonating. It can be used. But it's just as difficult for those of us who do the research to apply it consistently. And I always catch myself making mistakes and falling into using phrases that I know don't work, but it's just such a habit. Environmental groups that I work with closely also, we just are of a certain kind, and we make the mistake even though we know better. So we all have a lot of work to do. It takes practice is the thing I would say. And every time George and I engage with each other, I learn more. So I wouldn't blame government so much. The second thing I might say is, I feel fortunate to be in Canada right now. I feel fortunate to be living in a country that supports climate action. And anything that we have that can be available to make that work is, I think, going to be taken up. So I think we have maybe an opportunity here right now that George might not have as much of in the UK. And certainly in New Brunswick, I feel the government is very open to trying to make something happen and for us to succeed.
Can I add in something else on that, Alex?
Yes, go for it.
It seems that there is a strong correlation between governments which have a real interest in championing climate change messaging and governments which have a strong sense of national mission, shall we say. So when governments are confident, then they are often strongly, if they are that way politically inclined, they're strongly behind climate change engagement. And that means that the communications that they're most interested in are around national purpose. And certainly we've seen that in Canada, we've seen that in Britain. We're seeing it strongly in Scotland at the moment now, and we are in a strong position in Britain in terms of what's happening in Scotland, which is one of the most advanced countries in Europe in terms of doing this work, which has a very strong interest in engaging people in the population. And yes, they are taking the research seriously. So I think it's about this interesting combination between pride and identity and communications. It's not just putting that pride in the communications, but the demand for the communications often comes out of a sense of national pride.
Great, thanks both. I think what we should do now is we've had a few people asking a similar set of questions, which I think you were probably both anticipating, and it will be no surprise that people have been asking both about how in the US, the election and then inauguration of Donald Trump may reshape politics, and especially the politics around climate change. And similarly, on the other side of the Atlantic, Britain's exit from the European Union and the campaign that came up around that has reshaped politics over here. So I think what people have been getting at, if I'm summarizing in various ways, is how has this new populism or perhaps new right-wing populism reshaped, or how do you think it is going to reshape your communications work on climate change? What do you think it means for, say, the next 4 or 5 years? What do you think it means is going to be different? And how do you think that you, as people who work on developing these narratives, are going to need to respond to it? What I'd like to do is, George, if I can ask you to go first, and then Louise, perhaps if you can give a perspective from, I know you're not in America, but you're closer to closer to that political hotspot over there. So perhaps we could do it via our respective sides of the Atlantic. And perhaps, George, if you can say something about the UK, and then Louise, perhaps if you could say something about North America.
Sure. Okay. Am I on? Can people see me okay? I think what is a major concern across the English-speaking world is that climate change has now become a key marker of people's political identity. There's no intrinsic reason for that. I mean, in Germany, for example, none of the surveys is there any clear division in terms of climate change attitudes between people of left-wing or right-wing voting patterns or political values. But in the English-speaking world, it's become intensely polarized. And the recent developments in terms of the shift to the right with Donald Trump, with the Brexit vote, has tended to intensify political tribalism. That, as I said, is a major problem because now in America and increasingly in Britain, people's attitudes on climate change is a key determinant or key predictor of their political orientation. So it's not even as if people of the right are more inclined to disbelieve in climate change, but you could even go further and say, if you go and ask people what their views are on things, their attitudes on climate change will give you a very good predictor of where their politics are. And my worry is that things are becoming increasingly bundled up. So therefore, a skepticism of Europe was already strongly held with people who were high-profile climate change deniers. I use that word quite willingly. They would deny the science of climate change. We've seen this very strongly over in the States. My worry about where this takes us is increased polarization. And I think that therefore the real opportunity there is to try and to work with people from across the political spectrum, but particularly people on the centre-right, to build alternative narratives within which they can be seen to hold this. In terms of communications and general politics, of course, leaving the European Union does not necessarily undermine Britain's position on climate change or its commitment to be a strong voice on it. In fact, it may even reinforce our position in the world to go out there and speak independently on climate change. The worry is that the momentum towards leaving the European Union has been led by people who, for all of the other ideological reasons, are also inclined not to believe in climate change. So you have a bit of a toxic bundle there.
Yeah.
Thanks, George. Louise, can I ask you to address the same question, please?
Yes, thank you for this question. I'd say I've got a one-word answer, and that is discipline. If we ever needed to be more disciplined or disciplined in our approach to how we speak about climate change, that time is now. We have to be very disciplined. If we aren't careful, we will help contribute to the process of polarization, and we know the mechanisms well around how that happens. And so the work to engage the center-left, center-right is more important than it's ever been. The people who are already at the extreme ends are not going to be shifted. They're in the process of garnering and holding their position, which you can see from the results I showed you today. But there are people that do straddle that center that can be engaged and can be brought into this conversation and see themselves in it. And it requires discipline on our part. And the work that George and I have done and that we're presenting today is part of that process. So for me, the change in the U.S. Makes this work just more important. And the need to invest in this research even more important. That's what I have as a reality there. We can't afford, from an environmental perspective, from a climate change perspective, to not get the message right. And so it's going to take that work. It's going to take the investment. And as we can see by these varying results, you can't assume. There are some, I think, what I would call at the level of human nature that George has identified in his last slide there, the issue of fairness and so on. There's certain ones that you can maybe guess, that will likely work. But place by place, region by region, we actually have to do the research.
Great. So I think what I've done, I hope, is to bundle a lot of the questions up by theme together. So what I'd like to do now is give each of you a chance to just have a final word. So basically either to pick out something from either of your presentations that you feel like you want to kind of finish on and add more detail on, something you feel like you didn't have time for, something that you feel like is a kind of crucial take-home message. If there's one thing that you want people to take away from this webinar as they go, this is your kind of final last word and your chance to say it. So what I'll do is I'll go to George first for your final thought, and then back to Louise for the final thought of the webinar. And then after that, I will just say a few kind of closing practicalities, and we'll wrap the session up. So George, if I can come to you now for your kind of closing final thoughts, please.
Thank you, Alex. Well, final closing thought. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to do this, and thank you to Louise for your interest in working together. It's been really nice to do this, and I hope that I'll see some of you when I'm over. Of the things I'd like to say, I think the first thing I'd like to say, and it's been coming from what Louise has said, is to stress the fact that there is far too little of this kind of research. Most of the communications which is done, and that includes communications often, occasionally well funded by governments, is done on a very, very shaky evidence base of what works and what doesn't work. In Canada a while ago, you ran a national campaign across the entire of all of Canada called the 1 Ton Challenge, if you remember, which was a national campaign on behavior change, encouraging people to take up the 1 Ton Challenge to reduce their emissions by 1 ton with a series of simple measures. The evaluation done by the Canadian government afterwards is that it could find no measurable results coming from that in terms of actual behavior change. We found similar things happening in Britain and Australia with national campaigns. So the evidence base is critical, and in particular for this central audience we're talking about. So just to stress that. But it's a growing body of evidence. I think what is interesting and exciting about this is that the work that we're doing here builds, as we've said, on each previous piece of research. The challenge now is for us to publicize that. I think that's the next thing we need to do, is to take it and to share it internationally, because there'll be people around the world who will be interested in using this. As a result of that, I think I also have to say, very interesting looking at the results of this, that the reason why testing is so important is that there's always a surprise in there. You don't quite know what's going on until you go out and test it. And you can go in with your theories about what works and what doesn't work. And again, the method of this is an important one. You go in with a set of things that you have reason to believe will work, and you go and you try them, and you may find in the testing that actually some of them for hard to predict ways do not work. So I think the methodology of testing is important. So I think if I have take-homes, first of all, messages must be tested. We cannot assume it. I think another response of that, based on the recent work we've been doing in India and hopefully in other countries, is that testing process need not be extremely expensive, but it is required. It may simply be identifying people from your target audience and running materials past them and getting feedback. And the final thing I think I really want to say, which I was kind of drawing out in this, is that the weakness of this kind of survey and focus group research is that it removes the context and process of communication. In a survey, people read something anonymously and they make a response in a kind of vacuum. Now, that's useful in one way, but what it removes is that critical role of the communicator. So the really, really important thing, if we're going to build narratives on climate change action or carbon pricing, is to focus on who is telling this message. Are they trusted? Are they the right people for the audience? Are they using the right language? And as I've said, if you have, for example, an environmental activist organization going and speaking to a more conservative constituency using the right language, it can blow up badly because people will feel manipulated. So there has to be that match. And I think that's the key leading thought. Process and communicator is central to success.
Thanks, George. Louise, your final thoughts.
Okay. Well, from a researcher's perspective, I would my concluding comment is that mixed method works. That the combination of an iterative process, first of all, and combining this process of focus groups with testing through survey, coming back to focus groups, and so on. So from a method point of view, mixed method, I think, really is a critical piece of this. The second thing I would just conclude is that careful framing can increase support for climate action. If that's our goal, then we all have a responsibility to really take this on, because if we're trying to gain support, this is how we'll be more effective and more successful. So there's value here in terms of this work. Third, that it does take practice. It does not come naturally. We have to really do it over and over and over again. And I just conclude by saying that's one of the reasons we're hoping to get George here in June. We want to do train the trainer sessions, and so if people, and an event at the university potentially, a larger general public event with George speaking about his work. So if you're interested in that, just let me know. We'd be happy to keep you engaged on that process. So thank you, Alex and George. Wonderful.
So thanks everyone for joining us.